Problem with understanding everything going on in Israel is a typical binary, dumbed-down way legacy media feeds us information. You're either for something or against it, on this side or the other. There's no nuance. The argument that many are throwing out is the somebody in some distant place stole somebody's land a long time ago, so they should give it back. Seriously, that's about the amount of thought put into it. So imagine members of the Crow Nation showed up at your house and said, "This is our land. You stole it from us." How quickly would you vacate? You probably wouldn't. At the very least, you'd expect fair market compensation to come from somewhere. But if the full claims of the First Nations were ever carried out, the money to make such a plan occur exceeds the amount of money that exists. And should the plan still somehow get carried out, any money you received would be absolutely worthless, and there'd be nothing to purchase with it, including food. So, let's say somehow this all works out and makes sense to you. Well, once you hand over your property to the Crow, then members of the Arakira tribe show up and say, "Hey, the Crow stole the land from us in the first place." So, how much passage of time has to occur to nullify a claim on land? Recall, some people of European descent have been here 400 years. Family wise, obviously, they themselves aren't here, nor are the original claimants of the land. The situation in Israel is at least this complicated. Actually, a lot more. Around 70 AD, after a long period of civil strife and revolt against the Romans, the overwhelming remaining Jewish people in the region were killed, enslaved, or forced to flee. For some Jews and some Christians, this is the basic claim for the existence of Israel. To be clear, I don't agree with that claim. The fact that this pre 70 AD claim to the land exists is that it helps set the wheels in motion towards a Jewish state. And it is the reason I bring it up, not due to agreement. When Rome purged the Jews from Israel, the region became known as Palestine. The Romans would settle the area, the Byzantines would inherit it, one of the Islamic caliphates would take it over, and it would end up falling under control of the Crusaders for a generation, and then finally under the Ottoman Empire, technically the last caliphate. By 1800, it was clear that the Ottoman Empire was crumbling. Per custom of the time, the European powers would develop historic claims on locations. The Russians claimed the area around Istanbul, then Constantinople, based on ties between the Russian Orthodox and Greek Orthodox churches. The Greek Church, the Greek Orthodox Church still had its patriarch in Constantinople, and a sizable Greek minority lived around the Bosphorus. Russia proclaimed itself protectors of this minority. France had some weak ties to Lebanon and Syria, based on the existence of the Maronite Christians, who are an Eastern Catholic group still in communion with the Roman Catholic Church. This faith was seated there by a Frankish Crusader kingdom, so this allowed the French to claim this as an area of interest. England had no historical claim to the area, but wanted one really bad. In the early 1800s, the Ottoman census counted 500 Jewish families living in all of Palestine. The English establishment had four interests come together that would begin a process of transplanting European Jews in Palestine. First, British Jews were in the process of emancipation at this time and could now participate in English politics. The British Rothschild family had an interest in creating a Jewish homeland. Rothschild and his wealthy friends helped bankroll a slow but steady flow of Jews to Palestine. The British government wanted to create a sphere to claim protection over. By convincing the Ottomans to allow Jewish immigration, the British believed they could claim to be the protectors of the Jews in the Ottoman Empire. The British feared that the Ottoman Empire might collapse before they could make their claims. They believed Jewish settlers would help boost Ottoman tax base and improve government stability until the British Empire was in a better position to make their claim. Additionally, John Darby moved the doctrine of dispensationalism to the forefront of the English churches. One component of this system of belief was the requirement for the creation of the political state of Israel, that being necessary to fulfill the ties of prophecy and revelations. By the way, that is not a universal belief, as some may tend to think. Some of the English establishment would back the idea of a Jewish homeland in an effort to help fulfill these biblical interpretations. Between 1800 and 1913, there was a slow but steady process of moving Jewish families to Palestine. At this time, Palestine was mostly an agricultural backwater. Large swaths of lands were owned by absentee landlords and worked by poor local tenant farmers. Jewish families migrating in came there with a great deal of cash that was part of contributions from Zionist Jews from around the world. They purchased land from the absentee landlords for prices far above what local purchasers could pay, even if they were so inclined. Also, at amounts that were far more attractive than the rents those landlords were receiving on the land. When we get up to the point of World War I, things were looking for a while like the British and the Allies and its allies might lose. The Middle East would be secretly divided up by different powers and by different entities within the same powers. In many cases, these secret treaties created conflicting claims. In World War I, there was a sizable population of Jews in Germany. The British released the Balfour Declaration to create a mandate in Palestine that would create a Jewish homeland. The goal for the British doing this was to rally Jews from around the world to come join the British Army and also to create a fifth column of Jews within Germany. In the interwar period, with British control of Palestine, the Palestinian Mandate, it accelerated the movement of Jews from Europe to Palestine. The same pattern occurred with Jews coming in and the Jewish world community giving them money to buy land from Arab landlords and smallholders. Jewish immigrants would tend to look for land adjacent to other Jewish landholders. This created a small but growing enclaves of Jewish lands. Tensions were starting to rise between Jews and Arabs. For the most part, when violent acts occurred, it was Arabs attacking newcomer Jews, and not very much the old families who were recognized as having sort of a right to be there. Close to World War II, Britain severely curtailed Jewish immigration to Palestine in order to minimize tensions. The Brits had much bigger problems elsewhere and couldn't afford to be dealing with strife in Palestine. In the aftermath of World War II, the politics of Britain went against the idea of empire. The British citizens just basically had enough of having a worldwide empire. Violence against the British from both Jewish and Arab groups uh, flared up in the aftermath of World War II. The British decided that their ability and desire to keep things together in Palestine had ended. The British handed over the mandate to the UN, and the UN drew up a partition plan. The land was allocated roughly based on who owned the bulk of the land in each area. Remember, all this land in blue was purchased rightfully from their owners. And in each area, there were small groups and towns that were basically Arabs living in the Jewish area and Jews living in the Arabs area. It wasn't absolutely perfect. These were just essentially majority areas. If you looked at the map, essentially the yellow areas have very narrow access ways of roads going through them. The white area in the center is Jerusalem, which was supposed to be kept as an international city so that everyone could have access to it from around the world. The date for the end of the mandate is set, and then the British pull out. As this pullout date is approaching, both sides begin to arm themselves, and the 5 neighboring Arab states prepare to intervene. They pretty much telegraphed this, so people were preparing for that as well. The Jewish side had several advantages. They had better cultural cohesion than the Palestinian Arabs. Essentially, a lot of them had just gone through Holocaust survival in Europe, and a lot of them were very dedicated to the idea of a Jewish homeland. For the Palestinian Arabs, there was major cultural divides between country Arabs, city Arabs, and especially wealthy Arabs that were large landholders. Worldwide, money begins flowing to both sides to buy arms. The Palestinian Mandate had trained the Jews to organize themselves. They were being trained up to actually function as a government and had been functioning as a shadow government for over 20 years. This gave them a lot of the training and understanding they needed to organize and run a government. Also, the Jews were bulked up with World War II veterans from Europe, which also gave them an advantage. The end of the mandate caused Palestine to erupt into civil war. The Jews proclaimed the State of Israel. Arab leaders from Arab leaders from Palestine and from the Five Nation Army called on Palestinian Arabs to flee towards their positions. So many Palestinian Arabs actually ran away from their lands during this period. Not entirely sure what their logic was. They may have been looking for additional volunteers to help with the fighting. During the war and its immediate aftermath, Israel occupied and took over lands from the Arabs that had fled and gave them over to Jewish immigrants. Israel ended up succeeding in defeating the local Palestinians as well as most of the invading armies. Jordan was kind of a weird outlier. Jordan is the country to the right of Israel. The Jordanians had occupied the West Bank, which is that large yellow section in the middle, and annexed it. But at the time, the Jordanian army was heavily staffed still with British officers. When the war was called to a halt, essentially the Jordanians occupied it and the Israelis accepted that occupation. The Gaza Strip, the yellow area to the left, was occupied by Egypt, and the area known as Acre up to the north was occupied by Israel. Uh, so that area to the left, if you look, it's kind of like a boomerang. The top part of the boomerang is what we know as the Gaza Strip. The bottom part of the boomerang is part of the Negev Desert, which the Israelis would occupy after this war. In the end, uh, Israel ends up being very similar, but not exactly like the original partition that the UN had in mind. So essentially, the partition, the post-war Israel looks just like the partition, except for the northernmost chunk of land and the southernmost chunk of land. Now, one of the things that comes out of this is we have Palestinian refugee camps all over the Middle East. Note that a lot of these camps are outside of Gaza and West Bank. There are about 1.5 million refugees to this day occupying those camps. And if you go to any of these countries to these camps, they'll all look very similar. They're all either walled off or fenced off compounds. For the most part, none of the surrounding countries are interested in integrating the Palestinian refugees into their societies. And most of these people living in these camps are multi-generational. The people who originally occupied the camps are probably dead, long and gone. These are their children and grandchildren living there. In 1967, we have the 6 Days War, which resulted most likely from bad Soviet intelligence. The Soviets warned the Arab states that the Israelis were massing, and apparently they weren't. This caused the Egyptians to mobilize. Israel received 90% of its oil through the Straits of Tiran. That's the Red Sea. Israel warned that shutting down the straits would be considered an act of war because all their oil went through there. Egypt decided to shut them down. Israel declared war, and the end result was the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank end up becoming occupied. Now, the West Bank could easily be its own video. It's a lot of complications explaining the history of it and the politics and government of it. However, because of current events, I want to concentrate on Gaza at this point. If there's a call for people wanting to know about the West Bank, I can do a video on that in the future. The West Bank is the area where Israel has created some settlements. For the most part, this was expropriating land from people who fled the country 20 years earlier in 1947 or people who were dead. And I said for the most part, not entirely. 1987, 1993 is what was known as the First Intifada. It was an uprising in the Palestinian areas. It ended up, and it was mostly, as depicted here, you have a young man with a slingshot, and there was a lot of essentially homemade weapons being used in this particular uprising. What ends up happening is between 1993 and 1999, Israel transferred the newly created Palestinian Authority, gave them security and civilian responsibility for many of the Palestinian populated areas of the Gaza Strip, as well as the West Bank. That's from the World Factbook. And for me, again, the governance of the West Bank is complicated. Something that if people are interested, I will go over in another video. Israel erected barriers around the Gaza Strip because Hamas terrorists were attacking Israel in 1994. Since that time, Israel has provided all the water and electricity to the Gaza Strip for free, and they have donated large quantities of food. In 2000, a violent intifada or uprising began, and in 2001, negotiations to determine the permanent status of the West Bank and Gaza Strip stalled. Subsequent attempts to restart negotiations have not resulted in progress toward determining a final status of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Again, from the World Factbook. 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew all of its settlers and soldiers and dismantled its military facilities in the Gaza Strip, but it continues to control the Gaza Strip's land and maritime borders and aerospace. In early 2006, Hamas won a majority in the Palestinian Legislative Council election. Again from World Factbook. The West Bank under Fatah and the Gaza is under Hamas. Fatah is recognized as the ruling party of all Arab Palestine. However, Fatah was forcefully ousted from Gaza by Hamas. Basically, in the 2006 fighting, Hamas overthrew Fatah in the Gaza Strip in a coup d'etat. This led to the Second Intifada. And then 2008 to 2009 is something known as the Gaza War. And then there's the 2014 Gaza War. Although those periods are essentially very heightened tensions, there really hasn't been an absolute peace in the area in the existence of the State of Israel. So, in short, a large portion of the Jewish part of Palestine was purchased parcel by parcel by immigrants coming in from 1800 to 1947. So, is this land that should be returned to the Palestinians? Most of the people who lived there uh, didn't have ownership of it because a lot of this was owned by large landlords. Not that the landlords were large, the landlords owned large land. During the 1947 to 1948 timeframe during the Civil War, land was taken over from Palestinians that had fled the country. Most of the Jewish settlers that took this land are now dead. Most of the Palestinians who had this land taken from them are also dead. Most of the descendants of those Palestinians have no documentation to show what their family even owned at that time. How do you parse this land back to its rightful owners after all this time? There may be some legitimate disputes that could be worked out from the West Bank land where settlements have been built. Keep in mind, this was over 50 years ago. Once again, a good portion of these people are dead. The Palestinian Arabs who own the land and the Jewish families who have been living there in these parcels have been there for generations at this point. The West Bank is ruled by the legitimate government of Palestine. The West Bank is where settlements occurred. Gaza is controlled by Hamas. Hamas removed Fatah via a violent coup. Gaza has no settlements in it. So I hope that gives you a little bit of insight on it. I know this is a quick overview. I do have some more in-depth stuff on Israeli history in some of my earlier videos. I'll try to throw up the box to the first one to it if you're interested. If some questions occur to you, ask them in the comments below, and I can do my best to extrapolate on them either in the comments or if it's a big ask, I can possibly make another video expanding on the idea. All right, please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithm brought you here and you're not a regular viewer, please consider looking at my other titles. I go over a lot of different things. You're very likely to find something you're interested in. Consider subscribing. And if you know somebody who might find this interesting, please share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.